Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
We are here to jump into B to B to C. So for those of you that are not familiar with the acronym, it's business to consumer companies. So you as a company have a customer or a client, and they have a customer or a client. And in this case, we're going to call that end user, or the person that serves your client or your client serves, we're going to call them the user or consumer for the purposes of today's conversation. And so we want to cover 4 things in our conversation today. That when we talk about ecosystems, a lot of organizations focus on that ecosystem of their customer only, but we want to expand that definition or concept of the ecosystem to also include your end user or consumer.
Yes. Or your customers and user.
Yes, their customer or user. We also want to cover items that get at some of the importance around CX work, and the value of CX is truly focused on not only your client, but also their consumer. So you've got to address or understand both sides of that coin. If you don't, you miss those real opportunities to innovate, and you really don't know and have a huge gap in your insights around whether or not your offering or your product or service offering really helps or hurt your customer and their relationship with their consumer or user.
Yeah, they're all important. I think a lot of us, we do focus on our customers when paying out. But I think there are actually more cases where a lot of people probably think, no, we're pretty much B2B or we're B2C, and don't realize without breaking things down a lot of times. Sometimes it's really obvious, right? You have service providers who are implementing things. That's actually part of that ecosystem, not just the people who are buying the products. It's the people they may work with because of the complexity of the product. It's their end users. I think a lot of times we don't realize that kind of system exists out there. Who are they in that journey? If you're breaking things down, who are they either serving to, or actually someone outside your customer base is involved with something that relates to that product? And I know one reason we wanted to talk about this, Kenya, was we see it so much. Either it's kind of known, but not prioritized. Let's prioritize the customer. Well, that customer has end users and they're really ticked off. So, that's gonna, they're gonna blame you as their provider eventually. But I think a lot of times they're hidden ones. There are other either stakeholders or users involved in the process, or some interaction with the product or service, that if you don't do the right research, you don't really know they're out there, or you don't know how their involvement is impacting that workflow. So anyhow.
Right. When I look at the project we do, we focus on the B2B in product and service organizations, but also nonprofits. So we're looking at the nonprofit as just as much as we do a business and how they serve their customer. But I think what a lot of our clients fail to understand is you've got to be ready for us to not only talk to your customer, but for us to also talk to that end user, because we can't line up where those opportunities exist or where the challenges are without looking at both perspectives.
Yep. All users, all people who are having influence in that experience. Yeah,
that's right. Because you as a business or a nonprofit are supporting your client or customer's ability to provide a service or something else to their end user. And without that whole picture, you only have a piece of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the part I think a lot of organizations forget.
Yes. And just a really quick example, because I think sometimes it is hard for people to wrap their head around what exactly it means to be a B to B to C, is, we had one scenario or project. I'm being careful not giving anything away, but, the focus of the organization had been on those service professionals. They were a major business consumer of the product, and then they would go in and customize things and, serve it up to the consumer, the actual end users. What they found, they were just getting a lot of pushback, a lot of bad ratings, low satisfaction. Well, and it really turned out it was those end users. Everything's been built for those professional service people. And then when it fell into the hands of that true end user, they were giving the pushback. They were coming back to those professional service organizations saying, this is horrible. We're sick of you. We don't want your service anymore, or this is just a nightmare experience. So then there was this dependency on that service professional providing that information, because there was such a focus on just the B2B aspect, when really that end user needed to be added to the fold to really understand what those pain points were and what was going on. And I think that was a really good case, without giving too much information. That's always hard. But a really exact scenario we're talking about here. It was that consumer that was causing all the issues, we'll say, as far as satisfaction and the actual business pushing back on the organization providing the product.
Yeah, and I mean, the example that we all are familiar with is your doctor's office. Now we have to interact a lot through those portals. So we go in and schedule appointments, we get our labs, we might make payments through their portal. Well, the company that creates that portal is focused on, for the most part, the physician practices.
Yep.
And they are making sure that the physicians have everything they need to transact back and forth with the patient. If you don't actually talk to the patients as well as the provider of that tool, you don't understand that a lot of the pain is coming from your solution, and the patient is going back to the doctor's office grumbling about what they couldn't get, what they couldn't do, how they would rather do things manually. Because that's ultimately what's going to happen, is that end user or consumer is going to just work around your solution and go directly to your customer and either grumble or try to do things without using your tool.
Exactly. So yeah, you have to look at all actors involved, right? Because the physician, or even bigger than that, the hospital network, is going to have very different skills, intentions, objectives with the product than that end user who, that patient in this case.
Yeah. When you look at the ecosystem, you have to think about the fact that not only are you building a solution, either a product or service, there are also the people who have to support it,
yes,
and market it and sell it. And so what you start to have is feedback coming in from that end consumer or user that negatively impacts your support organization, or the messages coming back from your sales team are not positive. And what you're getting is, information coming in, but you're not doing the work to figure out why and how can we address or mitigate that information or those challenges.
Yep. And some of the ways, I know, we're always balancing in these quick live streams, what do you do? How do you address this problem? And I'm interested in hearing your experiences. I know some of yours, but to me, the first thing that we do when we go into any project is just start talking to people and start mapping things out. So we make sure we haven't forgotten any of those actors. So I mean, if you're doing due diligence and you're early on research and really understanding, okay, what's that workflow? What's that journey? And not just your consumer, your customer's journey. What is the journey end to end? You know, from the time I, maybe research a product, purchase it, implement it, then who's using it? Oh, and who's involved with them, maybe. I've even seen that case where you really have someone downstream that's in the end impacting everything when it comes to your product or service. And I know I've talked about a couple of those where there were surprise actors that no one accounted for, and they literally were the reason an entire service failed. And it was as simple as, if you had really looked at that flow, if you had really looked at that journey early on, you would have known this actor was involved, and you would have discovered it's so significant it can sink you. In that case, it was a literal, you're done. They were done. I mean, millions and millions of dollars, and the product, in this case, a service, completely ended up failing because of this actor no one had identified.
Yeah, and when you think about the work that you're doing with the team to improve your product or service, or the requirements that you have, if you don't have that complete picture, you are missing the opportunities, and your success metrics may not be tied to the right things if you don't have all of that information. And so the ways in which I've seen the most success in avoiding this is to ensure that when we plan out any sort of qualitative or observational work, we account for not only our client's customer, but also that end user. And we make sure that we're able to triangulate the information coming from those two feedback sources, the business goals and what they're trying to achieve, to ensure that what we build, the requirements sufficiently address the needs and pain points of their customer, but also that end user. Because in some cases, what you build in for your customer might make things worse for the end user if you don't have their perspective accounted for. So that's the biggest, to me, the biggest opportunity is there. And also when you're doing validation, there is a need to account for either the experience or something that allows that end user to interact with what you're conceiving or conceptualizing, so that they can actually give you the feedback around, yes, this is what I expect or hope for. Because if not, you're going to lose your customer, your direct customer, because they're going to find that there's so much pain with their end user that they're going to look elsewhere anyway.
Exactly. So if you're doing a billing system and you're focused on an office user who's invoicing and all that fun stuff, and you're reviewing designs and talking to them and watching them, that's wonderful. At some point in that journey, you forgot there's an accountant downstream, and everything you built is, and this is just another good example, everything you built is unusable now. Because now when you get down to that real flow in the end, when that office manager has to toss things, again, you forgot a very significant actor, and you just fall in kind of flat, and that's a great example of where innovation can come in as well. If you know these things, you might be looking at partnering, with a QuickBooks type provider, and figuring out ways where you're just playing nice behind the scenes because you have accounted for that. So just another example.
And you think about at the highest level, the capabilities that are most important, you have to think about that end user's experience around either sign up or configuration, for example, and the information that they're either giving or getting from your system or your service. And do they get what they actually need, or are there gaps in that information? So even though your customer might have certain needs because they're managing information or they're managing that service, that end user might have different needs that account for your system architecture or the processes that you define. And if you haven't accounted for those, you get yourself into a position where you either have to do some level of rework if you do gain those insights, but also you're in a position where you have questions around the experience. And if you don't engage that end user, you can't get the answers.
Yes. Yep.
So you'll still have that detail, and it'll be hard to figure out without engaging them.
Yes. And it is sometimes a hard balance, right? Because you can, well, one, at least identify it. You know, we've seen where no one even knew there was an actor that was impacting everything. So that's first. But we all, you know, also understand sometimes there are conflicting priorities from between that end user and your customer. So, but you got to identify those, know how to balance them. And I think you had a ticker go by. That's also where you can really start potentially coming up when you're solutioning. If you know that exists and you know you have to balance those priorities, that's where you identify a lot of new opportunities, opportunities to innovate, or it may be you just have to decide, you know, you just have to figure out and prioritize which is more important, you know, satisfying that customer or that end user if there are conflicting needs, but you got to identify it first.
That's right. You might even be satisfy your customer first. And you know, on your radar, there's an understanding that there's an end user who you need to account for or consider. And so as you deploy what you've done for your customer, you now know what to measure and to observe and to understand in order to figure out, okay, does our roadmap have to now account for that end user in our second or third iteration of what we do? So it gives you a line of sight into not only what to do today to focus on fulfilling the needs of your paying customer, but it also helps you to understand that longer term initiative or focus from a strategic perspective.
Yes.
So it's really important that you, again, if nothing else, at least understand that there is another actor or player in that whole ecosystem that you need to consider. That's where it starts.
Yes, at least know they exist, right? And then you can deal with solutioning and prioritizing and balancing those needs. But
that's right. And when you talk about ecosystem, your ecosystem might have sub-ecosystems. So there might be that small ecosystem that your customer plays in, and then there's that other ecosystem that their customer or user lives in. And so you've got to understand or have some sort of way to articulate that those two might be different, very different from one another, but the fact that two exist, or multiples exist, and that then allows you to map out those journeys as two different journeys, but that at some point there are points of intersection where there's, you know, some sort of connection in terms of your customer and that end user working together.
Yep. Think of blueprints, right? You know, yes. So yeah.
Exactly.
I'm agreeing with you, Kenya.
Yes. Just the takeaway from today is to not put yourself in a position as a decision maker or owner of defining what a solution is. Do not put yourself in the position where you say, yeah, we have a really good voice of customer. We are connected to our market, but you avoid focusing, also putting some energy and focus into their end user or consumer, because remember, there are two sides to that coin.
Yes.
And one side might have a higher priority, a higher investment, but just keep in mind, there is another side to things. And lining up what you can understand about those two and how they connect and intersect is really where it's important for you to be able to truly, truly innovate.
Absolutely. Rarely it's a workflow or journey map. Simple. You know, there's usually complicated things going on in there, or the map is a little more complicated than you might have on the wall. So
yeah, absolutely. And this is where we think about service blueprints that will help you not only understand all those different actors in their ecosystems, but also your teams from the front office and back office standpoint. So those that have some level of connection directly to those stakeholders, but then those in the back office that are doing the things to power what your product or service is doing. So, well, this was a good conversation as usual. We're already out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any questions, you know where to find us. Otherwise, have an awesome week, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. Have a great